My name is Roxy, and I came into this world, evidently as an afterthought, 12 years after my older sister Sarah and 10 years after Emma. That's a lot when it comes to family. The time it took for me to learn to hold a spoon passed almost unnoticed by them. By the time I started remembering anything about the world, they were already teenagers, hiding their anxieties and secrets in diaries I couldn't understand. As the youngest child, I was always on the periphery of their lives, like a shadow, formless and requiring no attention. My home in suburban Minnesota never felt entirely mine. It was filled with reflections of my parents' pride that didn't shine for me. They were proud of Sarah, who was always at the top of her class, scribbling complex formulas and words in her notebooks that I couldn't comprehend. They were proud of Emma, who became a star cheerleader, shouting slogans in the stands and peppering me with questions about when I would finally fit in with their world. But I was just the youngest, sitting at the table, pushing peas around my plate, listening to their conversations, and feeling not only superfluous but like a shadow almost fading against the bright lights of their lives. They were the center of everything, Sarah with her academic achievements, Emma with her athletic success, their talks about school and endless plans for the future. My reality was simply trailing after them, trying to squeeze into their world, only to remain on the outside. I remember the day Sarah brought home her first boyfriend. She was 16, and despite my pride in her, I felt a pang of sadness. I was only 4, peeking through the staircase railing at this tall boy with messy hair nervously shaking our father's hand. His voice was too loud, his laughter exaggerated, his eyes searching for approval. I didn't understand why so much attention was given to this stranger. All I saw was an inevitable shift in a world where I was once the center but now remained in the shadows. It wasn't much better with Emma. She started dating at 15, and her preoccupation with boys quickly overshadowed anything to do with me. To her, I was just another small figure whose questions and interests rarely received answers. Every morning, Emma left for school smelling of perfumes I disliked, her hair perfectly styled in an intricate arrangement, her eyes already hidden behind reflections that didn't include me. I always tried to join their conversations, to fit into her lively gatherings with friends, but she kept me at a distance. I overheard their late-night chats, how she told Sarah about her first kisses and the boys she danced with at school parties. I just sat in the corner, watching as their world became increasingly unreachable. My life was gray. I didn't belong to any of their worlds. My dreams, my secret passions, my first attempts at sketching in a notebook, all of it felt elusive. I didn't know how to approach them, how to be part of their wild, vibrant lives in which I seemed to be a random inclusion. I remember sitting in my room, watching my sisters decorate their belongings and discuss plans for the evening, while I couldn't even think of what to talk about with them. Sometimes, it felt like I didn't know how to live the way they did. And yet, despite all this, I held on to hope. Hope that one day I could be just like them. One day, I complained to my mom after Sarah had been gone for 5 hours. I had plans to meet Jenny, we were supposed to go to the mall, but Sarah had vanished, and I couldn't understand why she couldn't spare a couple of hours for me. Mom barely looked up from her Family Helps Family magazine. She didn't look at me, didn't ask what was wrong, and simply responded, as though my grievance was just one of the many she'd encountered in her life. Roxy, your sister needs time for herself. You'll understand when you're a mom. I was 16 when Emma announced she was pregnant. It was like a thunderstorm on a clear day. She, not expecting anyone else to react with excitement, squealed during a family dinner, shouting as if she'd won the lottery. Mom immediately raised her glass, Dad winked, and everyone at the table almost in unison started congratulating her, asking about the baby's gender, the hospital, and how long she'd take off for maternity leave. I sat in my seat, silently pushing potatoes around my plate, feeling a knot forming in my stomach. I said nothing, but my mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. What's it like when your whole life changes? What's it like to be a mom? Emma was older than me, but she had always been so vibrant, so open, always getting what she wanted. And now she was pregnant. When little Sophie was born, the story repeated itself with a new twist, a new speed, so rapid I could barely keep up. My weekends turned into a juggling act. Tiny hands reaching out to me. I always felt like I was holding it all together. Tyler, 3 years old and endlessly restless, ran around yelling about building a tower, while Sophie, with her delicate, almost weightless body, newly learning to laugh, wouldn't stop crying if anyone else held her. We'll build it, I promised, sitting on the floor, feeling him throw blocks onto the table with such determination it seemed he'd uncovered the most important secret of the world. Yet his tiny hands kept reaching for the baby, and I saw how he tried to soothe Sophie, his restless fingers brushing her nose, her tiny body squirming in response to his touch. The sounds grew louder. It was chaos. Homework? Forget about it. Not until they were asleep. If they ever fell asleep at the same time. But how could I make that happen? Tyler was stubborn, bursting with energy and constant demands, while Sophie was just beginning to distinguish light from shadow, her cries seemingly endless. In those moments, I felt an overwhelming sense of unease, as if the persistent thought that I wasn't ready for this was tightening its grip on me. But no one asked, no one cared about my thoughts or my worries. They just told me to push through it, like everything else in life. When I heard Jason ask me to go to the movies, I realized this was the chance I'd been waiting for. It was my small escape, a chance to break free from this relentless cycle, even for a couple of hours. He was an ordinary guy, but his simplicity felt like a breath of fresh air. He didn't try to be anything more than he was. His laughter, his earnest eyes when he spoke to me as if I were the most important person in his world, all of it sharpened my realization that I could be something significant, that I could be someone, not just a shadow among other shadows. I sat at the table, looking at my little brother and sister, thinking they could never understand. They couldn't comprehend what it felt like to be their age when the world seemed so vast and boundless, yet you knew you didn't belong to it. And perhaps you never had. With each passing year, I felt less like the younger sister and more like an invisible figure expected to stay in the background, so as not to disturb the rest of the picture. And then Jason invited me to the movies. It was my chance. My chance. I grabbed my coat, threw it on, and with the feeling of temporarily leaving everything behind, I headed to the door. Mom called a few weeks before Christmas. Her voice was hoarse with anticipation, as if she'd been preparing for something important but couldn't find the words to express it. "Everyone's been asking about you, Roxy," she said. "The kids miss their aunt." Those words, despite their warmth, immediately filled me with an odd sense of emptiness. I should have been happy, but instead, I felt uncomfortable. When you live apart from it all, away from the family, their little joys and worries, when you're not invested in these questions and concerns, such phrases feel like echoes from another life. My first Christmas break after starting college was complete chaos. Sarah was no longer just my older sister, she was now a mother of two. She had 2 sons, Tyler, whom I still remembered as a toddler, and newborn Luke, so tiny that even in an adult's arms, he looked like a fragile toy. It didn't align with the image of the girl who once came home with books, trying to teach me how to read. As for Emma, despite her naivety and restless dash toward life, she had added a boy named Max to her family, while also keeping up with Sophie, the little girl who continued to be an endless source of care and unrelenting joy. But that wasn't all. When I stepped into the house, they were all already there. Janet, standing by the door with a teapot in hand, shouted, "Roxy." Her voice burst in my head like a celebratory firework. The twins, 5-year-old boys, immediately descended upon me. Staring at me with a kind of desperate naivety, they simultaneously yelled and then froze, as if in unison, scrutinizing me like some peculiar novelty. In the next second, my cousin Rachel's 7-year-old daughter clung to my leg as if I were the only anchor she could hold onto in this endless world of adults and children. She was quickly followed by my cousin Mike's 9-year-old son and 6-year-old daughter, their smiles radiating genuine joy mixed with a peculiar wariness, as if they'd just heard about some wonder and now it stood before them. Mom's voice called from the kitchen, barely audible over the mountain of dishes she was forever trying to organize to fit the entire family's life. "Why don't you help out?" But you see, I couldn't. I couldn't dive right into this whirlwind of chores and worries. I couldn't just return and become who I used to be, a shadow that, over time, turns into a vibrant flower. I wasn't ready for any of this. I didn't know how to fit into this world where everyone always needed something from you. A world where your role was already written, where they waited for you but didn't really know who you were. It was so hard for me to return to this house, which had once been a cozy corner for me but was now a dazzling firework of sounds, faces, and expectations. I was here, but I still didn't feel like I belonged. The feeling that there was no place for me in this house, that I was somehow extraneous in my own life, haunted me. Deep down, I felt that I just wanted to be Roxy, without all these aunt, sister, and mom labels that came with strange obligations. My world was too small to fit them in, and theirs was so loud that I didn't know how to enter it. I tried to calm my thoughts, but the children kept reaching out to me, each of them like a tiny bridge between me and this world. Yet I still didn't feel like I could simply become a part of it. There was too much going on, too many people I barely knew. "This Christmas will be so wonderful with all these kids," Janet said, throwing open the doors and letting in a blast of cold air. I mentally counted 12 children. 12. A number that seemed impossible to fit into my world. So many little souls craving attention, shouting, laughing, bouncing around, all blending into a noisy sea of fragmented voices. I sat in the library, staring at my phone screen, but the words written by Mom didn't bring me comfort. Before the screen went dark, I reread the message once more, as if hoping it would change, that something in it would become different. The message remained the same, but something inside me had finally changed. 2 years in college had given me a new perspective. I began to notice how my roommate Kate left for the holidays and returned with stories of a real family. Not a made-up or idealized picture from magazines, but a genuine one. Her stories were filled with board games, noisy evenings in front of the TV, Christmas dinners overflowing with laughter and casual conversations. All of it felt so distant and foreign to me, and at some point, I realized just how much I had missed it. I sat in my room, listening to tales of how Kate's life seemed like a movie, a home where loneliness didn't exist. A place filled with little rituals that made a family truly a family. My friend Jessica, returning home after the holidays, complained most about having to share the TV remote with her siblings. She said it annoyed her that she couldn't just watch her favorite shows without someone constantly taking the remote from her. Meanwhile, I spent my holidays in my own way, as an unpaid nanny, looking after children who didn't feel like family, who didn't feel like a part of me. They remained strangers, even if their laughter filled the house. I didn't reply to my mom's message. I didn't have the strength. Instead, I packed my bag for the Christmas break with an unusual sense of calm that I hadn't felt in a long time. For some reason, at that very moment, I realized I had a choice about how to spend this Christmas. I could choose to be with them or to be alone. I could allow myself to create my own tradition instead of continuing one I might have fallen out of long ago. Walking down the street at a leisurely pace, breathing in the frosty air, I felt the world around me moving forward as I found my own place within it. For the first time, there was no fear of not fitting in. For the first time, there was no feeling that I had to please someone or meet someone else's expectations. I was Roxy, and that was enough. The quiet click of the door closing behind me felt like a period at the end of a very long sentence. And that sound, the closing of a door, the moment of separation from the outside world, seemed so significant, so final. I flopped onto my bed, the same double bed that had long felt like a small refuge, familiar and comfortable, yet still as alien as the house itself. It was part of my past, part of the life I had left behind to find a place in a world that continued to slip further away from me. I was where I'd always been, but in my head, the voices from beyond the wall, through the floor, still echoed, muffled but distinct. The sounds of chaos, which I now accepted as almost natural, as part of the everyday reality I no longer lived. The voices of adults rose and fell, met by children's cries, the occasional thuds as if something had fallen or someone had thrown a toy. Life was spiraling out of control again. My thoughts began to tangle with this noisy backdrop, and although I wasn't part of these scenes, I felt tied to the churning mix that was their reality. Can you believe how selfish she was? Came a muffled voice through the floor. It was one of those snippets of conversation that seeped through, as if the wall itself couldn't hold it back. I didn't know who was speaking, but the words made me smile. Let them talk. Let them finally confront reality. The reality that maybe they had all underestimated. It reminded me of myself. I sat in my room, listening to other people's quarrels, thinking about how much I could have changed if only I had been ready to be part of this life. But I wasn't. I had run away. To college. To my own world, which felt so different, yet just as empty. My phone vibrated, and Kate's name appeared on the screen. You did it. You finally stood up to them, she exclaimed, and her message radiated genuine admiration. That was so like her, someone who always knew how to manage situations, how to make everything move in the right direction. Operation Freedom is in full swing, she added. I've sent my reply and am now hiding in my room while they figure out how to parent their own kids. Kate always knew exactly what to say to comfort and encourage. I smiled, but her words left a strange unease in my heart. Because the truth was, no matter how much Kate joked, I wasn't sure I wanted to be part of all this drama. All these noisy holidays and sweet but exhausting kids. It all felt so foreign. What if I couldn't handle it, just like them? And what if I chose a different path altogether, a path where I could be myself, not part of their loud but tightly knit machine of life? At that moment, a knock on the door interrupted my message. I knew who it was. It was the kids. I felt my body tense, and the voice inside me quieted for a moment. Somewhere in the distance, from the kitchen, I could hear noise, conversations, laughter, more shouting. Aren't you coming down? Came a call echoing down the empty hallway. It didn't matter, yet I couldn't answer immediately. I waited, trying to deal with the strange feeling that had filled me, and slowly returned to myself. I typed a reply to Kate, exactly. That's it. I'm hiding. Let them figure it out on their own. I need some time to process all this. I lingered over a spoonful of mashed potatoes, deliberately licking it clean before responding. Time moved slowly, and I enjoyed the sensation of a slowed pace, as if I could delay the moment when I would return to the storm, the family's noise and commotion. The food was excellent, as always when eaten fresh, but I couldn't help noticing how these simple joys, like a good meal, lost their charm against the strange emptiness I felt inside. It's funny how it happens, when you haven't been part of this life for so long, but suddenly find yourself in the middle of it again, like a guest at your own celebration. Sisters. Duties, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady and calm, though a storm was raging inside me. I don't recall seeing free babysitter in any guide to sisterhood, I continued, suppressing a wry smirk. Perhaps you could point me to that chapter, right after the one where parents are supposed to watch their own kids. The sighs around the table, cutting through my words, would have been comical if they hadn't been so sincere. Aunt Janet actually clutched her pearls, as if they were the only thing holding her back from some desperate outburst. I hadn't realized people did that outside of movies. It seemed she was just waiting for someone to calmly smooth over the situation, and in her eyes, I could see something close to a plea, please, stop. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. Cousin Rachel suddenly became deeply interested in her green bean, studying it with such intensity that it seemed like the only object in her life worth focusing on. I noticed, with some surprise, how her small fingers clutched the plastic fork as if she were trying to hold her world together with its flimsy tines. Uncle Mike, always seeming restless and on the verge of disappearing, kept trying to bury himself in his dinner roll, as though his hope was to vanish from the scene for a few minutes. My parents exchanged that particular look that signified they hadn't yet decided what to do with me but were determined not to back down. That look was almost imperceptible, but I knew it well. It said everything, how they were trying to fix me, even though I had long stopped needing their adjustments. And yet, I felt that this table, these looks, these words spilling out of me like I was exorcising something dark, had become so familiar. Somehow, I knew that despite all these family scenes, the pretenses of harmony, everything inside remained unchanged. The irony was that no one acknowledged we were all, in our own ways, constructing worlds around ourselves, growing increasingly estranged from one another each year. Even in the warmest moments, when the kids laughed, when the table was set, when hugs were shared with love, I still felt like an observer, watching all these sounds and smells become part of a reality foreign to me. I set my spoon down, wiping my lips with a napkin, and allowed myself a moment of silence. My gaze swept across the table, where everyone, even if they weren't looking at me, instinctively knew I didn't belong fully in this moment. My mind filled with fragments of thoughts that demanded no resolution. This was my choice, my path, but maybe I wouldn't have chosen it if I'd had a choice in the first place. The conversations at the table faded into a hum, and once again, I felt that familiar detachment that had followed me since childhood. We were all moving along our separate paths, yet each of us was colliding with something inevitable. If you told me years ago that I'd be sitting at this table feeling like a piece of antique furniture, long past its function, I might have just laughed. But here I was, sitting at a table from which there seemed no escape, realizing, sometimes, to not belong is simply to exist. Sarah wasted no time. Her voice, sharp and commanding, echoed in the air as she interrupted the seemingly endless, increasingly heated conversation. "What was that performance you put on yesterday?" she asked, as though her words could serve as a final judgment. And in that moment, as her words shattered the silence like a hammer striking glass, I wondered, are we truly so distant from each other? Was I still the little sister, whose opinions and frustrations were unwelcome disruptions to the family's ideals and celebrations? "Enough that the neighbors now think we're bad parents," she added, her words cutting and precise. They hit me with their accuracy, and I felt my shoulders slowly slump, as though the weight I'd always carried had finally grown too heavy. I suddenly realized that all this time, I'd been holding in not just my exhaustion but a deep despair that had never found release. I sank into my chair, oddly calm, as though all the years of feeling invisible and extraneous in this house had dissipated in an instant. "You mean that I want to enjoy Christmas like everyone else?" I asked quietly, almost inaudibly, but my words seemed to pass through her, leaving a cold trace behind. This wasn't spoken lightly. It was an admission I had hidden from everyone for so long. I was simply tired of being the unpaid, unappreciated babysitter while everyone else got to enjoy the real holidays. I needed to say it. It wasn't just anger, it was liberation from the role that had been imposed on me since childhood. To be good, obedient, not to make noise, not to protest, to be the perfect little sister, who could always be relied on, because she wouldn't complain, wouldn't object. "But you never complained," Mom said, her brows furrowing in confusion. And that question, asked so quietly, almost innocently, made me suddenly feel the full depth of her misunderstanding. I couldn't help but laugh. My laugh was nervous, awkward, but still freeing. "Never complained?" "I've been complaining for years, Mom, but it was just too convenient to ignore me," I said, and as soon as the words left my mouth, I felt the heavy stone on my chest finally shift. I continued, not giving her a chance to interrupt. "Isn't it just too easy to keep exploiting the good little sister who never made waves? Isn't it just too convenient to let me stay as the one you could use however you liked?" They all started speaking at once. Their voices overlapped in a chorus of accusations and reminders about sisterly duty and family obligations. I watched as their faces reddened, their eyes flaring with confusion and frustration. Every word, every breath was directed at me like a wave ready to crash and drown me. "You're our sister. We're your family," Sarah shouted, her face contorted not just with anger but with that strange emotion only family arguments can evoke, a mix of love and hatred that erupts when someone finally opens their eyes and sees the whole truth. Dad went on about the importance of family duty, about how crucial it was to support each other, but his words now rang hollow, like a worn-out record. Words that had once been comforting now felt like manipulative platitudes. I couldn't believe that all this time, I had been just a cog in their machine, expected to endure everything simply because that's what was proper. As if being the youngest sister meant being the linchpin who absorbed it all without complaint, the one upon whom no real expectations were placed. And here I was, sitting at the center of this noise, feeling my simmering irritation finally boil over. Mom fell silent at last. There was a flicker of doubt in her eyes, as if she had suddenly realized her world wasn't as perfect as she wanted to believe. "You never said anything," she began, but her voice lacked the confidence it once carried. I waited. It was important to me that they understood I wasn't just the youngest sibling, that I was a person too, and my feelings mattered. I noticed Aunt Janet, still clutching her pearls, unable to tear herself away from the scene, tense as a drawn bowstring. She looked like she wanted to say something but held herself back, perhaps knowing that in this moment, silence mattered more than any words. January passed in a haze of new classes and quiet weekends. Time moved at a steady pace, and I threw myself into my studies. Over those weeks, I relearned how to enjoy solitude. It was a strange but necessary feeling. At first, I feared being forgotten and left adrift, but gradually, step by step, I realized I was living my own life, not existing on the fringes of someone else's. College life brought new friendships and horizons, and for the first time in years, I felt like I had my own plans, my own goals. I built them with friends, laughed over trivial things, and allowed myself to feel alive and free. February brought snow. And perhaps it wasn't just a natural phenomenon. The snow seemed like a symbol, covering everything that had withered and dead with a pristine white blanket. Several months had passed since I'd left home, and for the first time, I felt completely free, unburdened by stifling obligations and expectations. The blissful absence of family drama gave me space to simply be myself, free of roles and masks. But one cold Saturday morning in late February, I looked out my dorm window and saw them. Mom, Dad, and Emma, standing in the parking lot. They looked out of place, ill-suited to the scene of students hurrying to and from classes. Their presence in this world felt foreign, isolated, like something that no longer made sense but still tried to belong. My first instinct was predictable: pretend I wasn't home, retreat to my room, and let them sort out their own problems. But strangely, something in their body language made me pause. They looked different. Smaller, less like figures of authority and more like people who had driven 4 hours to get here, suddenly seeming less strong than before. In their movements, I saw something vulnerable, almost lost. And I realized I couldn't just turn away. I went downstairs to the lobby, where they stood hesitantly, looking around as if unsure of where to go. Our eyes met, and in that moment, I saw them as I never had before, not as parents, but as people who had stepped into my world, perhaps unsure of how to navigate it. Dad's gaze was tired, but there was hope in it. Mom, as always, tried to appear composed, but something in her posture told me she was weary of her roles too. Emma, standing slightly apart, didn't seem like the confident woman I'd always seen her as. There was something different in her eyes, anxiety, like a child who'd lost her way. "Can we get you a coffee?" Emma spoke first. She always started conversations when no one else knew how to begin. There was something determined in her voice, but also tentative, almost like a plea for help she couldn't articulate. "We'd like to talk," Mom added, her words quiet but carrying something more than just a desire to chat. It was a request for understanding, for a conversation none of us might be ready to have. I nodded and suggested we go to the campus cafe. At that hour, it was empty, a place where we could hide from prying eyes, where we could talk without the weight of onlookers. We sat at a corner table, and the silence immediately began to fill the space between us. Not a peaceful silence, but a heavy, oppressive one. A silence of anticipation. We sat there, unsure of how to start. Emma picked up her coffee cup, raising it to her lips but not drinking, her gaze meeting mine. Dad sat quietly, rubbing his forehead as if trying to organize his thoughts. Mom, always the centerpiece of our family, now seemed more vulnerable than all of us combined. "Roxy," Mom began, but her voice faltered, as if the words refused to come out. She took a sip of her coffee, but it didn't help. We understand that you need time, and we don't want to impose, but..." I felt a tightness in my chest. I knew what they were going to say. I had expected it, yet somehow it was unexpectedly difficult.